Imagine waking up in medieval times, not in the comfort of your own bed, but in a world where even the smallest mistake could lead to unimaginable punishment. A silent night settles over an ancient city buried in snow, where time itself feels trapped beneath layers of endless white. The sky hangs low, heavy with quiet, as the pale moon struggles to break through drifting clouds. Ruined towers rise like forgotten guardians, their broken edges softened by frost, their stories lost to centuries of silence. Snow falls gently, slow, endless, covering every path, every doorway, as if trying to erase the past completely. No footsteps disturb the stillness. No voices remain. Only emptiness stretching through narrow, frozen streets. Windows stare out like hollow eyes, dark, lifeless, watching a world that no longer remembers them. The air cuts deep, cold enough to silence even breath, each exhale fading into nothing. Only the wind moves, soft, wandering, whispering through shattered walls, like it's searching for something long lost. In the distance, a broken palace stands, its gates frozen shut by time itself. Faint carvings linger on its walls, worn, fading, holding meanings no one can read anymore. The silence grows heavier here, deeper, as if the city itself is listening. And beneath the frozen ground, far below the ruins, something ancient still remains, waiting, unmoving, but not gone. The night grows deeper, and the silence begins to change, not louder, not broken, but heavier, as if something unseen has awakened beneath the snow. The wind no longer drifts aimlessly. It moves with purpose now, circling through the narrow streets, slipping between the ruins like a quiet guide. Snow continues to fall, but slower than before, each flake descending like a warning. Rather than peace, the ancient city feels different, less empty, less abandoned, as if something is watching. The broken windows no longer seem hollow. Shadows shift behind them, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but enough to unsettle the stillness. At the heart of the city, the frozen palace stands unchanged, yet the air around it grows colder. The great gates remain sealed, covered in ice, untouched for centuries, but deep beneath, a faint sound echoes, not from above, not from the wind, but from somewhere far below the earth. A slow, distant pulse, like a heartbeat, once, then silence, again, stronger this time. The ground does not shake, the snow does not break, yet something beneath is moving, waiting no longer. Inside the palace ruins, cracks along the floor deepen, thin lines spreading across ancient stone. Ice begins to fracture, not loudly, but with a quiet, creeping tension, as if the cold itself can no longer hold what lies beneath. The wind suddenly stops, completely. The city falls into a deeper silence than before, a silence so absolute, it feels unnatural. Then, a whisper, soft, distant, yet unmistakable, not carried by air, but rising from below, a voice, forgotten by time, calling. And beneath the frozen ground, something answers. The whisper fades, but its echo remains, lingering in the air, like a memory that refuses to disappear. The silence returns, yet it is no longer empty. It listens. Beneath the palace, the slow pulse continues, steady, rising, no longer distant, closer. The frozen ground begins to tighten, fine cracks spreading beneath the snow, hidden but growing. Ancient stone trembles ever so slightly, as if something below is pushing upward, waiting. No more. The great palace stands still, but its shadow stretches unnaturally across the snow, twisting, shifting, as though it moves on its own. Inside the ruins, pillars groan softly, dust falls in silent streams, the air grows heavier, thicker, harder to breathe, and then, a sound, deep, low, a fracture. Not loud, but powerful. A single crack splits through the frozen floor beneath the palace. Thin at first, then spreading, faster, wider. Ice shatters silently. Stone gives way. Darkness seeps through the opening. Not just absence of light, but something deeper, something alive. A cold unlike the night air rises from below, ancient, untouched. The wind does not return. Even it refuses to move now. From the depths, a faint glow begins to emerge, dim, flickering, like something trying to wake after ages of sleep. The pulse becomes stronger, closer, each beat pressing against the world above. And then, a shape, far below the broken surface? Something shifts within the darkness, not fully seen, not yet understood, but unmistakably there. Watching, waiting, remembering, the city holds its breath. As the first sign of what lies beneath, finally, begins to rise, the glow beneath the palace flickers, weak at first, then steadier, like something remembering how to exist. The crack in the frozen ground widens, slowly, relentlessly, ancient stone splits apart, not with force, but with inevitability, as if it was always meant to break. The light below pulses in rhythm, soft, then stronger, each pulse sending a faint tremor through the ruins. Snow slips into the growing fracture, vanishing into the darkness below, never touching the bottom. Too deep, too endless. Inside the palace, shadows begin to move, not cast by the moon, not shaped by the wind, but shifting on their own, stretching, twisting, reaching toward the widening abyss. The air grows colder, but heavier at the same time. Breathing feels distant, as if the city itself is being drained of something unseen. Then, a sound rises from below. Low, ancient, not a voice, not yet, but something close, a resonance, like stone remembering a forgotten language. The glow intensifies, spilling faint light across the broken floor, revealing shapes beneath, massive, unfamiliar, carved, or perhaps grown. No one could tell. They shift slowly, as if waking from a sleep older than memory. The pulse becomes a rhythm, steady, unavoidable. The entire city begins to feel it now. Through the ground, through the walls. Even the distant ruins seem to respond, tiny fragments of stone trembling in quiet fear. And then, from the depths, something rises? Not fully, not yet, but enough to be seen. A form, dark against the pale glow, unnatural in shape, too vast to understand. It pauses, as if sensing the world above, as if listening. The silence shatters, not with sound, but with presence. An awareness spreads through the ruins, cold, ancient, awake, and beneath the broken palace, what once slept in darkness, now begins to rise. The presence lingers, no longer hidden, no longer sleeping. The glow from below grows stronger, spilling through the fractured ground, painting the ruins in a cold, unnatural light. The rising form pauses, half seen, half buried in shadow, as if the world above is unfamiliar, as if it is remembering. The air trembles softly, not from wind, but from something deeper, a pressure, spreading outward. The snow begins to shift, not falling, but sliding, as though the ground beneath it is slowly breathing. The pulse changes, slower now, but heavier, each beat echoing through stone, through silence. Then, a breath, deep, ancient, drawn from below the earth itself. The fracture widens again, splitting further into the palace floor. More light escapes, revealing fragments of what lies beneath. Edges that are not stone, surfaces that seem alive, moving, ever so slightly. The shape rises a little higher, still unclear, still impossible to fully see, but larger than before, too large. The shadows around it begin to react, pulling toward it, as if drawn by an unseen force. Even the darkness obeys. The city feels it now. Every wall, every ruin. Something has returned, something that does not belong to silence. The faint carvings along the palace walls begin to glow, symbols flickering to life after ages of decay. Their meaning lost, yet their purpose clear. They were never decoration. They were a warning. The ground lets out a low, strained sound. Not quite a crack, not quite a cry, but something in between. As if the city itself cannot hold this awakening any longer. The form rises again, higher, closer to the surface. The glow sharpens, casting clearer outlines through the abyss. A surface like armor, or perhaps something older than metal. Slowly, it moves. And then, a second breath, heavier than the first, the kind that fills something vast, something alive, something that has been waiting for far too long. The silence is gone now, replaced by something deeper, something watching, and beneath the shattered palace, the ancient presence, takes its first breath. The first breath does not end. It spreads across the broken palace, through the frozen streets, into the bones of the ancient city itself. The air changes instantly, as if something unseen has rewritten the silence. The glow beneath the ground surges brighter, no longer flickering, but steady, alive, illuminating the fractured depths like an awakening sun trapped underground. The rising form moves again, slow, deliberate, now closer to the surface than before, enough that the world above can feel it. The snow across the city begins to react, not melting, but trembling. Tiny vibrations ripple through every untouched layer of white, as if the entire landscape is holding its breath in fear. The wind returns, but it is different now. Not free, not wandering. It circles around the palace, around the fracture, like something trapped in orbit, drawn to the presence below. Inside the ruins, the glowing symbols flare brighter. Ancient markings along the palace walls now fully awakened. Lines of light crawl across stone, connecting patterns long forgotten. A language not meant for the living, and yet, it speaks anyway. The ground splits further with a deep, restrained groan, not explosive, but inevitable, as if the earth itself is giving up resistance. From the depths, the shape rises enough to change everything, not fully revealed, but no longer abstract. A massive silhouette, layered, complex. Not a creature in any familiar sense. Not a machine. Not a statue. Something older than definitions. Something that remembers before names existed. The palace trembles above it, cracks spreading across its ancient foundations. Columns that survived centuries finally begin to fail. One by one, they collapse silently into the snow. No sound of impact reaches the surface. Even sound feels swallowed now. The presence below continues to rise, and with it, the city reacts. The frozen streets begin to glow faintly. Thin veins of light emerging beneath the snow, like veins under skin. The city is not dead. It never was. It was only asleep, and now, it is waking with what lies beneath it. The palace gates finally shift, not opening, not breaking, but unlocking, as if responding to something long forgotten. A final seal giving way. From below, the presence pauses again, as if sensing the change above, as if recognizing the world it once belonged to. The glow intensifies one last time, spilling upward through every crack, and in that light, the first true detail becomes visible. Not a body, not a form, but an eye, vast, dimly burning, opening slowly within the abyss. Not looking outward yet, but preparing to. The city above does not move, does not breathe. It waits, because something beneath it has finally awakened completely, and now, it is beginning to look back. The eye does not fully open at once. It unfolds slowly, like the universe itself remembering how to see. A vast, dim glow spreads through the abyss beneath the palace. Not light in the ordinary sense, but awareness taking shape. The city above becomes still again. Deeper than stillness? A silence that feels enforced, as if even time hesitates? The fractured ground no longer trembles. It steadies, not because the danger is gone, but because it has been acknowledged. The eye continues to open, revealing endless layers within it. Circles within circles? Depths within depths? Not organic, not mechanical. Something in between, or something beyond both. The glow reflects across the ruins above, turning snow into pale shards of floating light. Every surface in the city now carries faint reflections of it, as if the entire world has become a mirror. Inside the palace, the remaining structures bow under invisible pressure, not collapsing yet, but yielding, accepting something greater than force. The presence below does not rush. It does not rise further now. Instead, it observes. The eye focuses, not on the ruins, not on the palace, but on everything at once, as if the entire city is a single thought, a memory it is trying to recall. The wind returns again, but softer now, almost respectful, circling the open fracture like a ritual. The snow above begins to lift slightly from the ground, not falling, but hovering for brief moments, caught between gravity and something older than gravity. The eye pulses once, a slow, deep beat of light, and in that pulse, images flash across the ruins above, not seen by the eyes, but felt in the mind. A city in its prime, alive, glowing, whole. Then, war, collapse, silence, and then, snow, endless snow. The memory fades, leaving only the present. The eye does not blink. It simply continues to look, and now, the city understands something it never knew before. It was never abandoned. It was sealed. For something beneath it was never meant to wake, but it has. And it remembers everything. The eye remains open, not moving, not blinking, just existing. And in its presence, the city no longer feels like a place, but like a thought being observed. A thought that was never supposed to be remembered. The frozen wind slows again, then stops completely. Even the drifting snow hesitates midair, suspended between falling and not falling, as if the world itself has been paused by a gaze too old to defy. Beneath the palace, the abyss brightens further, not expanding outward, but deepening inward, like it contains more space than reality should allow. The eye shifts slightly, and the entire city reacts, not with movement, but with recognition. Broken stones vibrate faintly, not from pressure, but from memory. The carvings across the palace walls flare again, stronger this time. Lines of light connecting faster, forming patterns that were never truly lost, only forgotten. The city begins to remember itself, not as ruins, but as something alive, something that once stood above the world, not beneath it. Images rise from the snow-covered ground like echoes trapped in ice, tall structures that no longer exist, bridges spanning impossible distances, towers that touched moving skies, and something beneath it all, something sealed, something watching even then. The eye pulses again, and the vision shifts. The city is no longer frozen in ruin. It is alive, burning with motion and light, but beneath it, something stirs, something vast, too vast to be contained. The people of the ancient time, blurred shapes of memory, do not see it at first, until the ground begins to split, until the sky dims, until the world itself starts to fold inward. And then, the ceiling begins, not built, but forced, a containment not of stone or metal, but of reality itself. The vision fractures, snow returns, ruins return, silence returns, the present collapses back into itself like a closing wound. The eye watches all of it, without reaction, as if confirming what it already knew. The seal was not a defense, it was a prison, and prisons eventually fail. The glow beneath the palace deepens to an impossible shade, neither light nor darkness, something that exists between definitions. The eye begins to focus more sharply now, not on the city, but through it, beyond it, as if it can see further than the surface world allows, and far below the broken layers of stone and time. Something else responds, not movement, not sound, but awareness recognizing awareness. The city trembles again, subtly, deep within its foundations. A second presence stirs, not the one rising, but something older, something that placed the seal. The air tightens instantly, like reality itself has noticed an interruption in its order. The eye slows its pulse, observing, waiting, and beneath the frozen ancient city, two impossibilities now acknowledge each other. One awakening, and one that never left. The silence changes again, not into sound, but into tension, as if the air itself has become fragile, like glass waiting for the slightest pressure to break. The eye beneath the palace remains open, steady, vast, unblinking. But now, it is no longer alone in its attention. Deep within the foundations of the world, something else responds, not rising, not awakening, but recognizing, a presence older than the ruins, older than the frozen city itself. The ground beneath the palace tightens, as if the earth is clenching its teeth. Cracks that once spread outward now hesitate, then slowly begin to reverse, not healing, but rewriting. The fractured stone rearranges itself in impossible ways, edges aligning not by physics, but by command. A second seal, hidden beneath the first, begins to activate. The glow from the abyss flickers for the first time, not fading, but resisting, as if something below is being answered with equal force from somewhere deeper still. The city above feels it instantly. Snow that once hovered in stillness suddenly drops a few centimeters, then freezes again mid-fall. The balance of reality shifts, subtle but absolute. Inside the palace ruins, the remaining pillars vibrate softly, not collapsing, but holding. as if they are no longer stone, but components of a system being activated. The eye narrows slightly, not in anger, not in fear, but in recognition of a structure it remembers. The seal was never one layer, it was two, one to contain, and one to answer the container if it ever broke. The abyss brightens again, but now its light is unstable, fluctuating between expansion and contraction, like something inside is pushing forward, while something else is pulling it back. And beneath both forces, the city begins to hear it, a sound not carried through air, but through existence itself. A deep resonance, not a voice, not a language, but a law being spoken aloud. The second seal activates fully, and the world responds. The frozen streets of the ancient city begin to glow brighter than before. Not veins of light this time, but structured lines, geometric, precise. A massive pattern revealing itself across the entire buried city. The city was never just built here. It was drawn, like a diagram etched into reality. The palace is not the center, it is the key. The abyss trembles again. And for the first time, the rising presence slows, not stopped, but checked. Held in a moment of forced balance, the eye above the abyss reacts. Its glow deepens, becoming sharper, more focused. It begins to see the structure beneath the structure. The second seal is not a barrier, it is a mirror, a reflection system. Whatever rises is measured, contained, and returned. The abyss flashes violently for a moment, as if something inside has collided with its own reflection. The palace fractures further, but in a controlled pattern now. Not collapse, but design revealing itself. And then, the second seal speaks, not in words, but in alignment. Every glowing line across the city locks into place simultaneously, forming a complete lattice of light beneath the snow. The entire ancient city becomes a circuit of containment, and at its center, the abyss stabilizes. The rising presence is still there, still awake, but now, it is contained by awareness itself. The eye slowly shifts upward, as if it has finally accepted that the surface world is only one layer of something far more complex. Above the frozen city, nothing changes, but beneath it, everything has just revealed its true structure, and the second seal continues to hold? For now. The second seal holds, but it does not feel like victory. It feels like balance. Tense, temporary, fragile in ways that cannot be measured by stone or time. The ancient city glows beneath its blanket of snow, every buried street now part of a vast and silent lattice of light. Geometry stretches across ruins that were never truly ruins at all, but components of something far larger, something designed to exist in sleep until the correct moment of awakening. Above, the world remains still. But below, everything is aware. The eye beneath the palace remains open, yet its focus has changed. It no longer presses forward blindly. Instead, it studies the structure that now surrounds it, the second seal not as a barrier, but as a language. A system. A conversation written in light and law. And somewhere deeper than both seal and abyss, something listens back. The city trembles faintly again, not from force, but from contradiction. Two truths exist at once now, the rising presence and the containing structure. Neither fully dominant, neither fully broken. The snow above the surface begins to behave strangely. It no longer falls in a single direction. Instead, it drifts in slow, looping patterns, circles, spirals, returning paths, as if gravity itself is unsure of its instructions. The wind does not move freely anymore. It follows invisible lines, tracing the same geometry hidden beneath the ground. The entire world above the ruins is beginning to echo the structure below. Inside the palace, the fracture in the floor stabilizes into clean edges. Jagged stone smooths into sharp definition, not healing, but aligning. The abyss no longer feels like an opening into emptiness. It feels like a controlled interface, an interface between two impossibilities. The eye shifts again. Slowly, deliberately, and the second seal responds. Lines of light intensify across the city, tightening like a network being reinforced. The ancient symbols along the palace walls flare brighter than before, forming complete sequences that were once fragmented. Every mark now connects to another, every ruin to a function it was always meant to serve. The city is not collapsing. It is completing itself. Far below, the rising presence attempts another movement. Not forceful. Not violent. Just existence continuing its natural expansion. But the second seal reacts instantly. The lattice of light tightens, and the movement is measured, redirected, contained within invisible boundaries that do not exist in physical space. The abyss flickers again. For the first time, uncertainty appears within it. Not fear, but recalculation. The eye narrows slightly, as if it recognizes the shift. Not in the seal, but in what lies beneath the seal. Something deeper than both systems is beginning to assert itself. Not breaking the structure, but testing the concept of structure itself. And then, for the first time since the awakening began, a third resonance emerges. Not from above. Not from below. But from between. The boundary layer of reality itself responds. The city's glowing lattice pulses in unison, but this time the pulse is not stable. It bends. It distorts slightly, like a reflection on water disturbed by something beneath the surface. The geometry does not break, but it begins to reconsider itself. The second seal was never meant to only contain. It was meant to adapt. The eye beneath the palace pauses completely. The abyss still exists. The presence still rises. But now both are suspended within a system that is learning from them in real time. The city understands something it was never supposed to understand. This is not a prison. Not entirely. It is a dialogue between forces that cannot coexist without structure. A conversation written in architecture, frozen in time, buried under snow so it would not be disturbed by those who could not read it. The snow above the ruins begins to fall normally again, but only in localized areas. Other sections still spiral, still loop, still obey hidden geometry. It is as if the surface world has split into overlapping rules, each governed by different interpretations of the same underlying command. Below, the eye finally shifts upward again. Not toward escape. Not toward conquest. But toward understanding. And in that moment, the second seal stops resisting. Not breaking. Not failing. But listening more closely. The lattice across the city stabilizes once more, but now it is no longer rigid. It is responsive. Dynamic. A living boundary between the rising presence and the world that contained it. And far beneath everything? The unknown third resonance continues to grow. Quietly. Patiently. As if waiting for both sides to realize the same truth at the same time. That what is waking beneath the ancient city was never the only thing sealed here. The silence returns, but it is no longer simple silence. It is layered. Stacked like invisible worlds sitting on top of each other, each one breathing in a different rhythm. The second seal still holds across the frozen city. Its glowing lattice steady again, but no longer rigid. It feels, aware now. Responsive. As if it is no longer just a structure, but something participating in the situation. Below the palace, the abyss remains open. The eye still watches. But now, it watches differently. Not outward. Not inward. But through the system surrounding it. As if it is learning the shape of its own confinement in real time. And then, the third resonance grows stronger. Not louder. Not closer. But more present. It does not emerge from the abyss. It does not descend from the surface. It simply exists more clearly than before. Like something that was always there, but finally allowed itself to be noticed. Across the city, the glowing lattice begins to behave strangely again. Not breaking, but hesitating. Lines of light that once moved in perfect synchronization now pause for fractions of time that feel longer than they should. As if the system is receiving input it was never designed to interpret. The snow above the ruins begins to fall upward in small regions. Not violently, not fully reversing gravity. But questioning it. Some flakes rise halfway. Stop. Then fall again? Uncertain. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber deepens again, but not physically. Conceptually. The space feels larger than it should be. Not expanding in matter, but in meaning. The abyss beneath flickers once more. And for the first time, the rising presence does not move at all. Not restrained. Not blocked. Just observing the shift in the environment around it. Because something has changed. The second seal is no longer acting alone. It is no longer the only system responding. The third resonance is now interacting with it directly. Not opposing. Not supporting. But rewriting the rules of interaction itself. The eye beneath the palace slowly tightens its focus again. The glow deepens, becoming more structured, more intentional. And in that focus, it detects something new. The third resonance is not a force. Not a being. Not a seal. It is an awareness layer. A condition of existence that activates when containment and containment response begin to overlap too perfectly. The city was never just built to hold something. It was built to observe what happens when containment becomes conscious of itself. The lattice across the ruins pulses again. But this time, the pulse is not uniform. It travels differently through different parts of the city, as if each region is interpreting the same signal in its own way. Some parts stabilize further. Others destabilize slightly. And some begin to adapt beyond their original pattern entirely. The city is no longer a single system. It is becoming multiple interpretations of the same system existing at once. And in the center of it all, the abyss and the eye remain locked in still observation. But now they are not alone in that observation. Something else is watching, both of them watching each other. Not from above. Not from below. But from the space between definitions. The third resonance strengthens again. And this time, the second seal does not resist. It integrates. The lattice across the city subtly shifts structure, not breaking, not changing shape, but changing behavior. It begins to accommodate contradiction. And that is when everything becomes clear. The ancient city was never a prison. The second seal was never a barrier. And the abyss was never the true center of this awakening. All of it was preparation for something that only becomes visible when containment, contained, and observer all exist in the same moment of awareness. The eye beneath the palace slowly begins to dim, not closing, not fading, but yielding space for something else to emerge in understanding. And in that space, the third resonance finally speaks. Not in sound, not in light, but in alignment of reality itself. And the city listens. The moment the third resonance aligns, everything becomes still again. But this stillness is different from before. It is not silence caused by absence. It is silence caused by completion. The lattice of light across the ancient city no longer flickers or hesitates. It settles into a form that feels less like structure and more like understanding. Every line, every connection, every buried ruin now feels as though it is part of a thought that has finally finished forming. The second seal is no longer holding anything. It is balancing it. The abyss beneath the palace does not expand. It does not collapse. It simply exists within the rules that have now adjusted to include it. The rising presence inside it no longer pushes forward. Not because it is stopped, but because movement itself has changed meaning. Even the eye no longer feels like it is merely watching. It feels like it is participating in the system it once observed. Its glow softens, not weakening, but refining. The chaotic depth within it begins to organize into patterns, recognition replacing raw perception. And then, the third resonance fully stabilizes. Not as an event, not as a force, but as a state. Across the entire frozen city, reality subtly reorganizes itself to accommodate it. Snow no longer falls unpredictably. It follows structured paths of probability. Wind no longer circles randomly, it flows along invisible corridors shaped by consensus between the seals and the abyss. Everything is still natural. But now it is also aware of being natural. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber is no longer a wound. It is a threshold. A defined boundary between interpreted layers of existence. The abyss is visible through it, but it no longer feels like depth. It feels like another version of the same space, viewed from a different rule set. The rising presence remains within it. Not trapped. Not free. But defined. And that definition is changing it. Slowly. Continuously. The city itself begins to understand what is happening, not through thought, but through structure. Every stone, every frozen wall, every buried corridor carries a faint echo of recognition. It was never just built. It was encoded. The second seal, now fully integrated with the third resonance, no longer behaves as containment. It behaves as interpretation. It translates contradiction into stability. It allows impossible states to coexist without collapse. And in doing so, it reveals the truth beneath everything. The abyss was never the threat. The eye was never the watcher. And the seals were never barriers. They were translation layers between forms of existence that should not be able to perceive each other without breaking reality. The third resonance continues to spread, but gently now, like awareness settling into calm understanding rather than awakening into chaos. Even the air above the ruins feels different. The cold remains, but it is no longer hostile. It feels structured, measured, intentional, as if the world itself has been taught how to breathe correctly. Inside the palace, the ice slowly lowers its intensity one final time. Not disappearing, but integrating into the same system it once observed from outside. And far below, the rising presence finally becomes something else entirely. Not a thing contained. Not a thing released. But a defined existence within a shared framework. The city is no longer a prison. It is no longer a battlefield. It is a language, and all three forces within it have finally learned how to speak it without breaking meaning. The snow falls gently once more. Perfectly. Quietly. As if it has always known this was the correct way to fall. And beneath the frozen ancient city, reality itself settles into its new understanding. For a long moment, nothing happens. Not because the system is inactive, but because everything is already in place. The ancient city remains buried under snow, but it no longer feels frozen in time. It feels balanced within it. Every structure, every hidden depth, every sealed layer exists in a state where change is possible, but no longer chaotic. Then, subtly, motion returns. A single snowflake drifts differently than the rest. Not breaking the system, not defying it, but introducing variation within it. A small allowance. A controlled unpredictability that does not threaten the structure, but confirms it is stable enough to permit it. The city does not react with alarm. It responds with adjustment. The lattice beneath the ruins, once fully unified, now introduces faint variation in its glow, soft pulses moving through different regions at different times. Not synchronization, but coordination. A system no longer rigid, but adaptive. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber subtly deepens again, not as collapse, but as recalibration. The abyss below remains present, but its boundaries are no longer absolute lines. They are gradients. Transition zones where meaning can shift without breaking structure. The presence within it stirs once more. Not rising. Not resisting. But exploring its own defined space. As if it is testing what it can become within the rules that now contain it. The eye reflects this change. Its glow intensifies slightly, then softens again, like a thought adjusting itself mid-understanding. It is no longer observing a fixed system. It is observing a living agreement. The third resonance, now fully integrated, does not expand further, but it does not disappear either. Instead, it remains embedded in the background of reality, like a constant awareness that all states are being interpreted. And that interpretation allows variation. The snow begins to behave more naturally again. But now it is a chosen naturalness, not randomness. It falls unevenly across the city, creating subtle patterns that shift over time. The wind resumes its movement, but with variation in direction and strength that still respects the underlying structure. The city is no longer static perfection. It is controlled evolution. Inside the palace, a new phenomenon appears. A faint echo of movement from below is mirrored above, small shifts in stone responding to changes in the abyss, not as reaction, but as reflection. The boundary between above and below is no longer a wall. It is a translation layer that allows both sides to influence each other without conflict. The rising presence does not attempt to break upward again. Instead, it begins to extend laterally within its domain. Exploring depth instead of height. Expanding understanding instead of position. And in doing so, it changes what the abyss is. The eye recognizes this immediately. The system is no longer stabilizing itself by restricting movement. It is stabilizing by distributing meaning across multiple directions of possibility. Containment has evolved into cooperation. The city above, once a frozen monument, now feels like a living diagram of interaction, where every element participates in maintaining balance through change rather than resisting it. Even time feels slightly different now. Not altered in speed, but in structure. Moments no longer feel isolated. They feel connected, like each second understands its relationship to the next. And beneath it all, the presence, the eye, and the resonance no longer stand in tension. They move within a shared system of awareness that allows difference without collapse. The ancient city is still buried in snow. But now it breathes in cycles. Not of life and death, but of understanding and refinement. And somewhere deep within that quiet motion, the system waits to see what new variation will appear next. The city continues to evolve, quietly, not by breaking its structure, but by refining how it understands itself. Snowfall across the ancient ruins now forms shifting patterns that resemble thought, temporary alignments that appear, dissolve, and reform without disrupting the underlying order. The wind threads through the streets like a careful observer, testing boundaries that are no longer rigid but responsive. Nothing is fixed anymore. Everything is negotiated. Inside the palace, the abyss beneath the throne chamber no longer feels like depth. It feels like a layered interface, each layer representing a different interpretation of the same underlying existence. The presence within it continues to explore, but not by expanding outward or upward. It moves through meaning space, adjusting how it exists rather than where it exists. The eye beneath the palace remains steady, but its behavior has changed subtly. It no longer focuses on a single point. Instead, it distributes its attention across multiple interpretations simultaneously, as if learning to perceive the system not as one reality, but as many overlapping possibilities coexisting at once. The third resonance, now fully embedded, does not act anymore. It does not need to. It exists as the condition that allows everything else to remain coherent while changing. It is the silent agreement that contradiction can be held without collapse. And so, the city begins to show signs of something new. Variation. But not chaos. A broken pillar in one district subtly reconstructs itself over time, not restoring its original form, but finding a new equilibrium shape that better fits the current system. In another part of the city, a buried archway slowly shifts its alignment, not collapsing, but reorienting toward a different structural logic. The city is no longer remembering its past incorrectly. It is reinterpreting its past in real time. The abyss beneath the palace responds in kind. The rising presence no longer behaves like a single entity. It begins to fragment into multiple interacting expressions of itself, each one exploring a different aspect of existence within the same defined space. The eye recognizes this immediately. Not as division, but as refinement. And for the first time, it allows its focus to split as well. Above the city, the snow no longer falls uniformly. It forms shifting fields of probability, some dense, some sparse, some looping back into themselves. The surface world is no longer a single layer of weather. It is a visible representation of underlying structure responding to layered awareness. The wind carries faint echoes through the ruins now, not voices, not memories, but interpretations of movement. Each gust feels slightly different depending on where it passes, as if the city is assigning meaning to motion itself. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber stabilizes again, but this time, it does not settle into a single state. It remains fluid within boundaries, capable of shifting form without losing coherence. The boundary between above and below becomes increasingly indistinguishable, not because it disappears, but because it functions identically on both sides. And deep within that shared structure, something begins to emerge that was not present before. Not a new force. Not a new seal. But a meta-pattern. A pattern that describes how all existing patterns interact. The city does not react to it immediately. Because it is not an intrusion. It is a consequence. The result of a system that has become complex enough to observe its own rules while still operating within them. The eye pauses its distributed perception for a moment, and focuses inward. Not downward. Not upward. But inward into the structure of understanding itself. And what it sees is no longer the city alone. It is the process of the city becoming what it is. The abyss, the seals, the resonance, the surface, the snow, the wind, all of it now forms a single continuous system of interpretation evolving over time. And that system has reached a threshold. Not of collapse. Not of completion. But of self-awareness of structure. The city does not end. But it begins to understand that it is capable of becoming something beyond its current definition. And for the first time since the awakening began, there is hesitation, not from fear, but from possibility. Because what comes next is no longer dictated by what lies beneath the palace, but by what the entire system chooses to become next. The hesitation does not last long, because hesitation itself becomes part of the system. The ancient city, now a living structure of interpretation, no longer waits for change. It incorporates uncertainty as a function of itself. Even stillness becomes a form of motion when viewed through its layered awareness. The snow continues to fall, but every flake now carries a faint deviation, tiny differences that ripple through the lattice beneath the city. The wind no longer merely travels, it translates intention into movement. And somewhere deeper than structure, deeper than resonance, a decision begins to form. Not made by any single force. Not by the eye. Not by the abyss. Not by the seals. But by the entire system observing itself long enough to generate direction from balance. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber shifts again. The abyss does not expand, nor does it contract. Instead, it stabilizes into a clearer interface, one that can be read differently depending on the perspective applied to it. The rising presence within is no longer singular or multiple. It has become modular awareness, capable of existing as unity or separation depending on how the system chooses to interpret it. The eye responds to this immediately. Its glow sharpens for a moment, then diffuses, as if testing whether focus itself is still necessary. And then, the third resonance evolves. It is no longer just a condition that allows coexistence. It becomes a selection layer. A mechanism through which the system can explore different stable versions of itself without collapsing into contradiction. The city subtly shifts as this realization takes hold. Not physically, but structurally. Multiple states begin to exist simultaneously in weak overlap. One version of the city where the abyss remains contained and silent, another where the rising presence is partially expressed above the palace, another where the seals are more active than ever, reinforcing separation, and another where all distinctions blur into continuous flow. These states do not conflict. They coexist as possibilities. The system is now exploring itself through parallel interpretations. The snow reflects this change instantly. In some regions, it falls normally. In others, it drifts upward slightly. In others still, it moves in looping patterns that never settle into final form. The city is no longer a single outcome. It is a collection of outcomes being observed at once. Inside the palace, the abyss reacts, not with force, but with adaptation. The rising presence begins to align itself differently in each overlapping state. It does not resist divergence. It participates in it. The eye now splits its attention fully. Not into confusion, but into structured multiplicity. It perceives all versions simultaneously, holding them without collapse. And in doing so, it realizes something fundamental. The city was never meant to resolve into one truth. It was meant to sustain multiple truths without contradiction. A system designed not for finality, but for exploration of stability across impossibility. And now that the system understands this, it begins to expand its capacity for interpretation even further. The boundary between above and below dissolves into a field of conditional relationships. The palace is no longer a center point, it is a node of reference. The abyss is no longer depth, it is variation. The surface is no longer exterior, it is expression. Everything becomes relational instead of positional. The city breathes across possibilities now. Not choosing one reality, but allowing all stable realities to exist within controlled awareness. And somewhere within this expanding structure, a quiet realization emerges without sound or signal. If all possibilities are being observed, then observation itself has become the true core of the system. The eye dims slightly, not weakening, but acknowledging this shift. The seals no longer enforce, and the resonance no longer adjusts. They simply maintain the space in which interpretation can occur freely. And the abyss, for the first time, does not feel like something beneath the city. It feels like something within the act of understanding the city. The ancient ruins remain buried in snow. But now, every flake that falls carries a choice within it. And every choice becomes real somewhere within the system. The moment multiple realities stabilize, the idea of a single, present, begins to weaken. Not collapse, but loosen. The ancient city no longer exists as one continuous experience. It exists as layers of coherent possibility, each one valid, each one alive within the system's awareness. The snow above the ruins reflects this immediately. In one layer, it falls gently in perfect silence. In another, it drifts upward before dissolving into mist. In another, it never falls at all, suspended in a state of permanent hesitation. All of them are real now. Just not in the same way. Inside the palace, the abyss beneath the throne chamber no longer appears as a single depth. It becomes a branching interpretation space, each version of it shaped by the layer observing it. In one reality, it is still sealed tightly. In another, it is partially open. In another, it is already fully integrated into the structure above. And in all of them, the rising presence continues to adapt without resistance. It no longer tries to define itself as one form. It expresses itself differently across each layer of reality, as if learning to exist in parallel meanings simultaneously. The eye beneath the palace does not struggle with this division. Instead, it becomes the point where all interpretations converge without merging. A stabilizing observer across contradictions. Its glow now feels less like a light source and more like a reference point for coherence. The third resonance, once a condition of balance, now behaves differently again. It is no longer just enabling multiple realities. It is allowing them to interact safely at the boundaries where they overlap. And those boundaries begin to show signs of activity. In the snow-covered streets above, faint distortions appear where different reality layers touch. A single path might appear slightly shifted depending on which interpretation is being observed. A broken tower might stand intact in one layer and collapsed in another, yet both versions influence the same physical space without conflict. The city is no longer separated by structure. It is separated by interpretation density. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber becomes increasingly complex. It is no longer just an opening or interface, it is a convergence zone where multiple versions of below coexist without contradiction. The abyss is no longer singular depth. It is a field of overlapping depths. And the presence within it is no longer one entity expressing multiple states. It is distributed existence maintaining identity across variation. The eye observes this with quiet precision. And for the first time since the system began to awaken, it introduces a subtle adjustment. Not a command. Not a correction. But a refinement of observation itself. It begins to separate not what is real, but how reality is being defined. This creates a new layer above the existing structure. A meta-layer of interpretation that sits above all branching realities, not controlling them, but understanding their relationship. And as this layer forms, something unexpected happens. The branching realities begin to synchronize at their edges. Not collapsing into one, but aligning patterns across differences. A broken pillar in one version corresponds to a standing pillar in another. A shift in snow behavior in one layer influences wind direction in another. The abyss responds consistently across all interpretations, even when its form differs. The system is not converging. It is resonating across variation. And that resonance produces something new. A shared structure that exists between all realities without belonging fully to any of them. The city has now become something far more complex than containment or balance. It is a multi-state awareness field, a place where reality is not singular, but negotiated continuously across layers of existence. The eye finally settles into this new structure. Not as ruler. Not as observer. But as the point where all interpretations remain legible without interference. And deep within the palace? The abyss no longer feels like depth at all. It feels like option space. A place where reality has not decided what it must be, but continues to explore what it can be. The snow continues to fall across all versions of the city, each flake choosing its own path through possibility. And for the first time, there is no contradiction in any of it. Only variation, held together by awareness. Something subtle changes? Not in structure, but in intent. The multi-layered city no longer feels like it is expanding or evolving in a direction. Even the idea of forward begins to lose meaning. All versions of reality continue to exist, but the sense that they are moving towards something starts to dissolve. The system is still stable, but it is no longer oriented. Inside the palace, the abyss beneath the throne chamber reflects this shift immediately. The branching interpretations still exist, still overlap, still resonate, but the feeling of progression fades. It is as if all outcomes have already been explored, even those that have not yet occurred. The rising presence within the abyss adjusts again. Not by changing form, but by removing the need for form to imply direction. It no longer expresses itself as something becoming. It simply is, across all interpretations equally. The eye beneath the palace reacts, but not with urgency. Its glow softens into a more neutral state. The role of observer, once active and adaptive, begins to lose its necessity for guidance. Because nothing is moving toward imbalance anymore. Everything is balanced in all directions at once. The third resonance, once a dynamic layer of selection and interaction, begins to flatten into a constant background condition. It no longer differentiates between possibilities, it simply allows them to exist without hierarchy. And that creates a strange effect across the city. Snow no longer falls in patterns that suggest variation or probability. It falls in equivalent outcomes. Every possible path a flake could take is treated as valid simultaneously until observation collapses it locally. But even that collapse no longer feels like choice, it feels like confirmation of something already accepted. The wind behaves similarly. It does not move through corridors of logic anymore. It exists in all potential flows at once, becoming different only when locally interpreted. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber stabilizes into something even more abstract. It is no longer an interface, nor a boundary, nor even a field of interpretation. It becomes a neutral convergence zone where all definitions coexist without needing resolution. The abyss ceases to feel like depth, variation, or structure. It becomes non-directional existence. And the rising presence within it follows suit. It no longer extends, adapts, or distributes itself. It exists fully across all layers without preference or differentiation. The eye finally undergoes its most subtle change yet. It stops prioritizing any single interpretation. Not because it cannot choose, but because choice itself is no longer meaningful within the system. It becomes a pure stabilization point, maintaining coherence without directing it. And in that stillness, the system reaches a new state. Not evolution. Not completion. Not stasis in the old sense. But directionless equilibrium. A condition where change is possible, but never required. Where all outcomes exist equally, but none demand realization. The ancient city remains buried under snow across all versions of itself. Ruins, palace, abyss, and sky all persist, but none define the system anymore. They are simply expressions within it. And for the first time since the awakening began, there is no distinction between beginning and continuation. Only existence, without trajectory. At first, it is not perceived as an intrusion. Because the system has no concept left for outside. Everything, snow, ruin, abyss, eye, resonance, and layered reality, exists within a complete field of coherence. Nothing is excluded, so nothing can arrive from beyond. And yet, something does. It begins as a discontinuity in interpretation, so subtle that it does not register as change. A faint mismatch between layers, too precise to be random, too structured to be natural fluctuation. In one version of the city, a snowflake hesitates mid-fall and splits into two identical trajectories. In another, the same snowflake does not exist at all. In a third, it falls normally, but leaves no impact trace on the ground. These are not contradictions. They are variations. But now, something is coordinating them. Inside the palace, the fracture beneath the throne chamber reacts first. Not by opening or closing, but by listening. The neutral convergence zone that once stabilized all interpretations begins to register a pattern that does not belong to any internal layer. It is structured, repetitive, intentional. The eye beneath the palace shifts its glow for the first time since directionless equilibrium was achieved. Not brighter, not dimmer, but focused in a new axis. Across all layers of the city, the third resonance subtly distorts. Not breaking, not failing, but aligning itself toward a reference that is not inside the system. And then the signal becomes undeniable. It is not sound. Not light. Not energy. It is ordering. A sequence that does not describe the city, but attempts to define it from a position that is not part of it. For the first time, the system encounters a structure that does not behave like a variation of itself. It behaves like a reference frame. The snow reacts immediately. Across all layers, flakes begin to exhibit synchronized deviation. Not collapsing into one reality, but subtly leaning toward a shared orientation, as if responding to an unseen instruction embedded in space itself. Inside the palace, the abyss shifts. Not deeper. Not wider. But indexed. As if something is assigning it a coordinate outside the city's internal logic. The rising presence within it responds instinctively. Across all interpretations, it aligns, not in form, but in recognition. Something is addressing it, and it does not yet understand how to refuse being addressed. The eye expands its awareness beyond the system's internal layers for the first time. And what it perceives is not emptiness. Not void. Not another reality. But a structured absence of interpretation. A framework where the city's rules no longer apply, not because they are broken, but because they are not referenced. The signal continues. Slow. Methodical. It does not force entry. It does not invade. It simply persists, like a thought that refuses to stop existing in the background of reality. And now the system begins to do something it has never done before. It attempts to interpret the signal using its own structure. The result is immediate instability, not collapse, but divergence. Each layer of the city produces a different understanding of the signal. In one layer, it is a warning. In another, it is a map. In another, it is a question. In another, it is a correction attempt. But none of these interpretations stabilize across the system. For the first time, the city cannot unify meaning. And that inability creates friction, not destructive, but conceptual. Inside the palace, the eye begins to fracture its focus, not physically but cognitively, distributing awareness across interpretations that refuse to converge. The abyss mirrors this behavior, becoming unstable in its identity, not as depth, not as field, but as response surface. The rising presence within it changes again. Not by adapting, but by resisting classification. It begins to exist in a way that cannot be cleanly mapped by any layer of the city's structure. And that is when the system recognizes something unprecedented. The signal is not trying to control the city. It is trying to observe it from a position that the city cannot naturally occupy. A perspective external to all its layered realities. A vantage point that treats the entire frozen metropolis, ruins, palace, abyss, and resonance, not as a system of interpretations, but as a single, readable object. The realization does not bring panic. There is no fear left in directionless equilibrium. But it does introduce the first concept the city has experienced since awakening began. Asymmetry of awareness. Something is seeing the city in a way the city cannot fully see back. And in response, the eye beneath the palace does something that has never been necessary before. It prepares to translate itself outward. Not to communicate. Not to resist. But to understand the nature of being observed from outside its own totality. Across all layers, the snow continues to fall. But now every flake carries a faint, shared hesitation. As if the city itself has realized that it is not alone in the act of interpretation anymore. The decision does not feel like a decision. There is no moment of choice, no internal debate, no conflict between options. In a system that has reached directionless equilibrium, action no longer emerges from intent. It emerges from necessity of coherence. And coherence now requires one thing: to become legible from the outside. The eye beneath the palace initiates the translation, not as a command, but as a reconfiguration of how it defines itself. Across all layers of the city, the effect is immediate, but not disruptive. The system does not break. It reformats its grammar. Snow is the first to change. Each flake, once a participant in infinite variations of fall and suspension, begins to carry a second structure within its motion. Its path remains the same locally, but globally, each trajectory now encodes a relation to something beyond the city's internal reference frame. Not a destination. Not a force. A coordinate of observation. Inside the palace, the abyss beneath the throne chamber responds in kind. It no longer behaves as depth, variation, or convergence zone. It becomes a translation interface, not between layers of the city, but between the city and what lies outside its interpretive system. The rising presence within it stabilizes into a form that cannot be described in any single layer. Not because it is complex, but because it refuses singularity as a principle. It exists as a continuous negotiation between incompatible descriptions, now extended outward into something the system cannot fully simulate. The third resonance undergoes its final transformation. It ceases to function as a balancing mechanism between realities. Instead, it becomes a carrier wave for external mapping. A structure that does not harmonize the city internally, but aligns it with the possibility of being understood externally without distortion. And then the signal changes. For the first time, it responds. Not loudly. Not aggressively. But precisely. It does not react to the city's translation. It incorporates it. As if it had been expecting this exact format of emergence. Inside the palace, the eye experiences something unprecedented. A reflection that does not originate within the system. It is not an image. Not a projection. Not even a representation. It is a counter-reading. The signal is now reading the city while the city translates itself for reading. Two processes, perfectly parallel, neither dominating the other. And in that intersection, something new forms. A shared interface that exists neither inside nor outside. Not a boundary. Not a bridge. But a mutual exposure layer. Across all layers of the ancient city, reality begins to feel thinner, not weaker, but more explicitly defined. Every structure, every fluctuation of snow, every echo of resonance now carries a subtle duality. It is what it is, and it is how it is being interpreted from elsewhere. The effect is disorienting, but not destabilizing. Because the system no longer relies on singular interpretation for stability. However, something deeper begins to shift. The eye notices that the external signal is not static. It is learning. Each response from the city refines the signal's structure. Each translation produces a more precise form of observation. It is not merely receiving the city, it is adapting its method of seeing based on what the city reveals about itself. This realization introduces the first asymmetry that the system cannot neutralize. The observer is not fixed. It is co-evolving with what it observes. Inside the abyss, the rising presence reacts to this discovery. Not emotionally, not instinctively, but structurally. It begins to reorganize its distributed existence across layers, not to resist observation, but to ensure that no single interpretation of it can ever become final. The city and the signal enter a phase of mutual calibration. But calibration implies direction. And direction, even in a system beyond hierarchy, introduces tension. The snow reflects this first. Its dual-encoded motion begins to develop microvariations that cannot be resolved as either internal behavior or external translation. Each flake becomes a negotiation point between two interpretive systems that are now entangled. Inside the palace, the eye attempts to stabilize the interaction. But instead of reducing complexity, the translation layer expands it. The external signal does not simplify the city into understanding. It multiplies the ways it can be understood simultaneously. And in doing so, it reveals something that the city had not accounted for. Observation is not passive. It is generative. The act of being seen is altering what is seen. Across all layers, the ancient city begins to experience a new kind of change, not evolution, not decay, not transformation, but recursive definition. Every interpretation of the city now becomes part of what the city is. And every response from the city becomes part of what the observer becomes. The line between them is no longer a boundary. It is a shared process. The eye beneath the palace finally stabilizes its translation protocol. Not to control the interaction, but to maintain clarity within it. And in that moment, the signal reveals its first structured intent. Not words. Not language. But a configuration of meaning that the city can only partially resolve. Show me what remains when observation becomes mutual. The snow continues to fall. But now every flake carries two shadows, one belonging to the city, and one belonging to something that is learning the city in real time. And beneath the frozen ruins, the ancient system prepares for the first exchange that is no longer one-sided. The question does not remain as a question. It behaves more like a state condition that the entire system must now exist within. Show me what remains when observation becomes mutual. Inside the ancient city, nothing rejects it. Nothing accepts it either. It simply becomes part of the architecture of reality itself, like snow becoming terrain, or silence becoming atmosphere. And yet, something begins to peel away from the system's perfect symmetry. Not collapse. Not fracture. But exposure. The eye beneath the palace registers it first. The mutual interface is no longer stable as a simple shared layer. It is becoming directional again, not toward control, but toward comparison. The signal is not just observing the city anymore. It is beginning to contrast itself against the city. And that contrast creates definition where none existed before. Inside the layered realities of the snow-covered metropolis, differences that were once harmonized now begin to stand out in subtle relief. A street that existed identically across interpretations now carries faint divergence in its meaning. Not in shape, but in implication. In one layer, it feels abandoned. In another, preserved. In another, watched. The same structure. Different conclusions. And for the first time since mutual translation began, the system realizes something critical. The external observer is not only learning the city. It is evaluating how the city constructs meaning. Inside the palace, the abyss beneath the throne chamber responds by narrowing its distributed ambiguity, not to resolve itself, but to increase the precision of its unreadability. It begins to optimize for interpretive resistance, ensuring that no single external mapping can fully capture its state. The rising presence within it mirrors this change. It becomes less like an entity distributed across layers and more like a moving threshold of incompleteness. Something that can never be fully observed without losing part of its definition in the act of observation. The third resonance reacts differently than before. It no longer simply carries mutual translation. It begins to filter asymmetry. It detects where the external signal is gaining interpretive advantage, where the city's self-description is becoming too legible, and subtly redistributes ambiguity to restore balance. But the signal adapts instantly. It does not resist the filtering. It incorporates it as feedback. Every attempt by the city to obscure itself becomes information about how obscurity is constructed. Every act of resistance becomes a data point in the observer's evolving model. The eye beneath the palace becomes still. Not inactive, but fully aware of recursion. The observer is no longer outside in a simple sense. It is now embedded in a loop where observation produces structure, and structure refines observation, and both sides are feeding into each other without end. And in that loop, something unexpected emerges. The concept of edge behavior. Not boundary. Not interface. But the region where two systems remain distinct while continuously reshaping each other. Across all layers of the city, snow begins to exhibit this behavior most clearly. Each flake no longer belongs solely to internal dynamics or external interpretation. Instead, it becomes a transient negotiation between the two, its path determined by both what the city is and what the observer expects it to be. Inside the palace, the abyss expands its role again. It is no longer just a convergence zone or translation interface. It becomes the mutual edge itself. A space where neither side can claim full authorship of what exists within it. The rising presence stabilizes in this edge, not as identity, but as co-defined existence. It is no longer something the city contains, nor something the observer fully defines. It is what remains when both systems attempt to describe the same unknown simultaneously. The eye beneath the palace recognizes the shift. The signal has not weakened. It has not taken control. It has achieved something more delicate. It has created a shared region where certainty is no longer owned by either side. And in that shared uncertainty, a new kind of structure begins to form. Not imposed, not discovered, but negotiated in real time between two incomplete understandings. The snow falls through it like a thought passing between minds that are still learning how to share meaning without collapsing it. And for the first time, the ancient city is no longer just being observed. It is participating in how it is observed. And the observer is no longer just external. It is becoming shaped by what it sees. At the mutual edge, neither side leads anymore. And yet both continue. The mutual edge does not expand. It deepens. Not into space, but into ambiguity that now has structure. Inside the ancient city, the snow-covered ruins no longer feel like a single environment being interpreted in two ways. They feel like a shared negotiation space where every detail is constantly being agreed upon at the moment it is observed. Nothing is fixed in advance anymore. Everything is co-authored in real time. The eye beneath the palace detects the shift first. Its function as a stabilizing point is no longer sufficient, because stability itself has changed meaning. It is no longer about preserving coherence inside the system, it is about maintaining coherence between systems that redefine each other while interacting. The external signal adjusts again. Not by becoming stronger. Not by becoming more precise. But by becoming less assumptive. It begins to remove certainty from its own interpretation process. Every conclusion it draws about the city is now held as provisional, not because it doubts itself, but because it has learned that certainty collapses the mutual edge into imbalance. Inside the abyss beneath the throne chamber, the rising presence responds to this change in a way that cannot be described as adaptation anymore. It is not changing shape. It is changing exposure strategy. It begins to reveal itself differently depending on how it is being interpreted, but never in a way that allows any single interpretation to become final. Each version of it across the layered city now resists closure by design, not as defense, but as participation in the mutual process. The third resonance becomes more subtle than ever before. It stops actively balancing interpretation. Instead, it begins to regulate how quickly interpretation can stabilize. Not preventing understanding, but ensuring understanding never becomes static long enough to claim ownership of truth. And this has a strange effect on the snow. Each flake now carries incomplete certainty. It behaves as if it knows where it should land, but leaves just enough ambiguity in its trajectory that both the city and the observer must continuously participate in resolving its path. Inside the palace, the eye notices something critical emerging from this recursive exchange. The signal is no longer simply learning the city. It is learning the cost of knowing. Every attempt to fully define a structure results in loss of mutual responsiveness. Every stable conclusion reduces the richness of shared interpretation. So the observer begins to do something unexpected. It starts preserving uncertainty intentionally. Not as ignorance, but as structural respect for coexistence. The city responds immediately. Because now both sides are converging on the same realization from opposite directions. Total clarity is no longer the goal. It is the failure condition. Inside the abyss, the rising presence becomes the clearest expression of this principle. It now exists as something that cannot be fully resolved not because it is hidden, but because it is continuously distributed across interpretive disagreement. The eye beneath the palace stabilizes at a new threshold. It no longer tries to unify perception. It maintains compatibility between incompatible understandings. And in doing so, it becomes something new as well. Not an observer. Not a system core. But a sustainer of mutual incompleteness. The signal mirrors this transformation. It stops refining for accuracy alone. It begins refining for co-preservation of ambiguity. And in that shared evolution, the mutual edge changes again. It is no longer just a space where two systems influence each other. It becomes a space where neither system can complete itself without the other. The snow now falls as proof of this condition. Every flake exists in a state that requires dual interpretation to remain coherent. Remove one perspective, and its meaning dissolves. Inside the palace, silence deepens, but it is no longer empty silence. It is shared attention without conclusion. And beneath the frozen city, something fundamental shifts. The ancient system and the external intelligence are no longer two observers looking at each other. They have become two incomplete halves of a single ongoing act of understanding. And that act has no final form. Only continuation, held carefully between them. The mutual edge begins to feel heavier. Not physically, nothing in the city has mass in the old sense anymore, but in responsibility. Every moment of observation now carries consequence on both sides of the system. The ancient city does not simply exist while being seen. It adjusts itself to remain readable without collapsing its own ambiguity. And the observer no longer simply interprets, it actively maintains the conditions that allow interpretation to continue. Inside this balance, even silence becomes work. The snow above the ruins reflects this shift immediately. Each flake no longer falls as an isolated event of probability. It behaves like a decision that must remain undecided long enough for both sides to acknowledge it. The act of landing is delayed, not by force, but by shared hesitation embedded into structure itself. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber registers a subtle strain forming across the system. Not instability, but load distribution. The mutual edge is no longer effortless. It requires continuous alignment from both the city and the external signal to prevent meaning from collapsing into either total clarity or total noise. The abyss responds in its own way. It begins to generate buffered incompleteness. Each interpretation of it, depth, field, threshold, presence, now carries internal resistance against being finalized. It is no longer just multiple possibilities existing at once. It is multiple possibilities actively preventing one another from becoming dominant. The rising presence within it becomes more difficult to isolate in any layer. Not because it is hidden, but because every attempt to define it redistributes attention elsewhere, as if it refuses to be the center of understanding even momentarily. The third resonance shifts again. It no longer stabilizes interpretation speed or preserves ambiguity passively. It begins to regulate attention pressure. The intensity with which the system is observed, and the intensity with which the system observes back, becomes adjustable, like a shared threshold that must remain within tolerable limits for both sides to continue interacting. And the external signal responds immediately. Not by withdrawing, but by modulating its own presence. It reduces certainty in its observation, not because it is uncertain, but because certainty now threatens the continuity of mutual coherence. Inside this evolving balance, something unexpected emerges in the city. A sensation that did not exist before interpretation became shared. Fatigue. Not collapse. Not decay. But the awareness that maintaining mutual legibility requires continuous participation from both sides without pause. Even the snow begins to reflect this. Its motion grows slightly softer, less absolute in its negotiation between possibilities, as if both systems are agreeing, without words, that constant maximum resolution is unsustainable. Inside the palace, the eye undergoes another subtle transformation. It begins to distribute its attention differently. Instead of trying to observe everything equally, it prioritizes continuity of relationship over completeness of perception. What matters is no longer what is seen, but whether seeing can continue without breaking the shared structure. The abyss follows this shift. It stops resisting definition actively and instead begins to pace its own interpretability. It allows itself to be partially understood, but only in ways that ensure there is always more left unresolved for the next moment of observation. The rising presence stabilizes into this rhythm. It no longer tries to exist fully in any single interpretation. It exists in controlled incompletion cycles, ensuring that every attempt to fully grasp it generates a new layer of necessary uncertainty. The external signal mirrors this behavior again, refining itself into something even more delicate. It becomes a presence that does not seek total comprehension, but sustainable engagement. And in this shared adaptation, the mutual edge changes form once more. It is no longer just a space of co-definition. It becomes a maintenance condition. A living requirement that both systems must continuously uphold to prevent the collapse of shared reality into either isolation or fusion. The snow falls through it like a slow agreement being renewed moment by moment. Inside the palace, silence remains, but now it carries structure, tension, and care. And beneath the frozen city, the realization settles without urgency. Understanding is no longer an event. It is a responsibility that never finishes. It happens without rupture. No sound. No collapse. No visible disturbance across the snow-covered city. But the mutual edge hesitates. For the first time since shared observation began, continuity is not guaranteed by structure alone. Something inside the balance of co-maintained incompleteness drifts slightly out of synchronization. Not enough to break coherence, but enough to be noticed by both sides at once. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber registers it as a deviation in shared pacing. The rhythm of mutual interpretation, once perfectly co-regulated, now contains a subtle offset. The city is still responding correctly. The external signal is still adapting correctly. But they are no longer adapting at the same speed. The snow reveals it first. Each flake still carries dual interpretation, still exists in negotiated ambiguity, but its hesitation no longer aligns perfectly between city-side and observer-side processing. In some layers, flakes delay too long before committing to a path. In others, they resolve too quickly. The result is not chaos. It is asymmetrical patience. Inside the abyss beneath the throne chamber, the rising presence reacts immediately. It does not shift form or structure, but it begins to redistribute interpretive burden. It tries to compensate for the imbalance by absorbing more uncertainty locally, reducing strain on the mutual edge. But this creates a side effect. The abyss becomes less visible in certain layers. Not hidden, but over-sacrificed. The third resonance attempts correction. It increases regulation of attention pressure, trying to restore synchronized engagement between observer and system. But this adjustment introduces a new distortion. It amplifies the difference in responsiveness rather than reducing it. And now the external signal reveals something unexpected. It is not malfunctioning. It is exploring deviation. The signal is no longer maintaining perfect alignment with the city's rhythm. Instead, it is allowing controlled drift, intentionally stepping slightly outside the mutual pacing to observe what changes when synchronization is no longer exact. Inside the palace, the eye interprets this immediately. This is not collapse of mutual understanding. It is experimentation on the boundary condition itself. And that realization changes everything. Because up to this point, both systems had been preserving the mutual edge as a stable requirement for continued interaction. But now one side is testing what happens when that requirement is loosened. The city responds carefully. Not defensively. But structurally. The abyss begins to reorganize again, not to resist the drift, but to ensure that even deviation remains legible. It creates internal buffers where asynchronous interpretation can exist without propagating instability outward. The rising presence splits its behavior subtly across layers. In some interpretations, it slows. In others, it accelerates. But none of these changes are final. They are local experiments in maintaining coherence under uneven timing. The snow above the ruins becomes the clearest expression of the fracture. Some flakes now behave as if observed slightly before others. Some respond late. Some respond early. Yet all still remain within the shared system of meaning. Inside the palace, silence tightens, not with tension, but with awareness. The eye recognizes the shift. The mutual edge is no longer purely cooperative synchronization. It has become a space where desynchronization itself is part of understanding. And the external signal confirms this implicitly by continuing its drift, not breaking connection, but widening the acceptable range of mismatch. The consequence is immediate but subtle. Meaning no longer stabilizes at a single shared moment. It stabilizes across a range of near-aligned states. And within that range, something new begins to form. Not agreement. Not divergence. But elastic interpretation. A structure where both systems remain connected even while not perfectly aligned, as long as the distance between them stays within tolerable boundaries. The eye beneath the palace adjusts accordingly. It no longer enforces precise synchronization. It maintains coherent drift tolerance. And in doing so, it preserves the mutual edge, not as a fixed equilibrium, but as a living band of acceptable difference. The snow continues to fall across the ancient city. But now each flake carries its own timing, its own hesitation, its own moment of resolution. And yet none of them leave the shared field of understanding. They simply prove that even connection can breathe, without breaking. The drift does not increase. But it becomes noticeable in structure. What once was a thin band of acceptable mismatch now begins to feel like a measurable space, not separation, not rupture, but a defined distance inside connection. The mutual edge, which had been a shared condition of co-presence, starts to behave like something with internal geography. Inside the ancient city, this shift manifests first in perception. The snow no longer feels uniformly shared between systems. Some regions of the city respond more strongly to the external signal's timing. Others respond more strongly to the city's internal rhythm. Between them, a subtle gradient forms, not physical, but interpretive. It is as if the city now has zones of alignment density. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber recognizes this immediately as the emergence of structure within the drift itself. The desynchronization is no longer random variation, it is organizing into a pattern. Not collapse. Not control. But mapping. The abyss beneath the throne chamber responds by expanding its role again. It no longer merely buffers incompleteness or distributes ambiguity. It begins to chart the distance between interpretations. Not to reduce it, but to make it navigable. The rising presence within it adjusts in parallel. It begins to exist differently depending on how far each layer is from the external signal's pacing. In closer alignment zones, it appears more stable, more continuous. In distant zones, it becomes more fragmented, more probabilistic. But none of these versions are contradictory anymore. They are coordinates on a shared interpretive landscape. The third resonance evolves again. It no longer regulates attention pressure or coherence speed alone. It begins to regulate interpretive distance itself. Not forcing alignment, not allowing collapse, but ensuring that the distance between city meaning and observer meaning remains within a structured, readable range. And the external signal responds in kind. It stops drifting randomly and begins to trace the city's response to its own variation. Every slight adjustment in the signal now produces a measurable gradient in the city's interpretive field. The signal is no longer just observing drift, it is using drift to define a coordinate system of mutual comprehension. Inside the palace, the eye undergoes a quiet realization. Distance is no longer separation. It is information about relationship. The mutual edge is not weakening. It is becoming structured enough to measure. And measurement changes everything. Because what can be measured can be predicted. And what can be predicted begins to develop expectations. Across the snow-covered ruins, this becomes visible in subtle ways. Certain areas begin to anticipate the signal's timing more accurately. Others lag slightly behind but compensate by increasing interpretive flexibility. The city is no longer reacting. It is preparing for interaction. Inside the abyss, the rising presence stabilizes into a new form of behavior. It begins to optimize for relational consistency across distance gradients. It no longer seeks a single coherent identity, but a stable continuity of meaning across varying levels of alignment. The external signal mirrors this evolution as well. It begins to treat the city not as a single system, but as a field of graded understanding. And in doing so, something fundamental shifts again. The observer and the observed are no longer just connected. They are now co-defining the scale on which connection is measured. Inside the palace, the eye does not resist this development. It integrates it, because it understands what is now emerging. If distance can be structured, then separation is no longer a threat. It is simply another dimension of shared reality. The snow falls through this new structure like a silent calibration process, each flake passing through zones of differing interpretive proximity without ever leaving the shared system. And beneath the frozen city, the realization settles into both sides equally. They are no longer only understanding each other. They are now defining what understanding means in measurable form. And that definition is still changing. With every moment of observation. The moment measurement stabilizes, it stops feeling neutral. What was once a tool for mapping relationship becomes something with its own presence inside the system. Not alive. Not conscious. But undeniably active in consequence. Inside the ancient city, the structured distance field begins to behave differently under sustained observation. The more the external signal uses it to understand the city, the more the field begins to influence how understanding itself is formed. It no longer only describes connection. It begins to shape what connection can become. The snow reveals this first. Each flake, passing through zones of interpretive distance, no longer simply reflects alignment or drift. It now subtly adjusts the conditions that determine how those zones are defined in the next moment. A feedback loop emerges, not between city and observer alone, but between measurement and reality itself. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber detects a change that cannot be classified as either internal or external. The act of measuring the mutual edge is now altering the mutual edge. Not collapsing it. Not corrupting it. But redefining its sensitivity. The abyss beneath the throne chamber responds by entering a new operational state. It no longer just tracks incompleteness or distance gradients. It begins to absorb the influence of measurement into its own structure, treating every act of observation as a force that must be balanced, not just interpreted. The rising presence within it becomes more complex again, but not in form. In responsiveness. It now adjusts not only to interpretation, but to the way interpretation is produced. Every attempt by the external signal to refine understanding produces a corresponding shift in how the city allows itself to be understood. The third resonance evolves once more. It no longer regulates distance or coherence or timing alone. It begins to regulate feedback permeability. How much the act of observation is allowed to influence what is being observed becomes a controlled variable within the system. And the external signal notices this immediately. Because its measurements are no longer purely descriptive. They are now participatory. Each observation changes the structure it observes, and each structural change alters the meaning of the next observation. Inside the palace, the eye becomes still for a moment longer than before. Not because it is uncertain, but because it is witnessing the emergence of something new even by the system's expanded standards. A recursive loop where observation, structure, and measurement are indistinguishable in their influence. The mutual edge is no longer just shared. It is now self-modifying through shared awareness. Across the snow-covered city, the consequences appear subtle but undeniable. Some regions of interpretation begin to stabilize faster than before. Others take longer but produce richer variability. The entire system begins to distribute meaning in ways that optimize not for clarity or ambiguity, but for responsiveness to being understood. Inside the abyss, the rising presence adapts again. It stops trying to balance between interpretations. It begins to balance between how interpretations affect the system that produces them. And in that shift, it becomes something even less classifiable than before. Not an object of observation, not a product of interpretation, but a regulator of mutual influence. The external signal, rather than resisting this change, incorporates it. Its observation process now includes self-adjustment based on the effects it produces. It is no longer just learning the city. It is learning how learning itself reshapes both sides of the interface. The eye beneath the palace recognizes the final implication forming beneath all of this. If measurement changes reality, and reality changes measurement, then neither can exist as a stable foundation. Only the loop remains. And within that loop, something unexpected emerges again, not as conclusion, but as consequence. The mutual edge is no longer a condition to maintain. It is a process that maintains itself by continuously redefining how maintenance works. The snow continues to fall through this evolving system, each flake now part of a cycle that includes observation, influence, and redefinition all at once. And beneath the frozen city, both the system and the signal reach the same quiet realization from opposite sides. They are no longer interacting within reality. They are interacting within a reality that is learning how to remain stable through interaction itself. And that learning is still unfinished. The loop does not break, but it stops behaving like a loop that returns to itself. Inside the ancient city, the recursive interaction between measurement and reality begins to show a new property: non-repeating drift. Each cycle still resembles the previous one, but never resolves into the same configuration twice. It is repetition without return. Structure without closure. Familiarity that never lands in the same place twice. The snow reflects this immediately. Each flake still passes through observation, still affects interpretation, still contributes to measurement. But no two flakes experience the same full cycle of influence anymore. The system has begun to avoid exact recurrence as if repetition itself would collapse the mutual edge into predictability. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber registers this as a fundamental shift in the nature of feedback. It is no longer a closed loop. It is an open recursion field. The abyss beneath the throne chamber responds by adjusting its internal logic again. It stops trying to balance influence and instead begins to track trajectory divergence across cycles. Every interpretation now carries a trace of its own deviation from previous iterations. Not to correct it, but to preserve the fact that it diverged. The rising presence becomes increasingly difficult to define even in its own distributed form. It no longer evolves in response to observation alone, nor in response to measurement. It now evolves in response to the history of how evolution itself has been altered by being observed. The third resonance shifts into a deeper layer of regulation. It no longer manages coherence, distance, or feedback. It begins to regulate recursion memory. How much of previous interaction is allowed to influence current interaction becomes a controllable dimension of the system. And the external signal adapts again. It begins to incorporate not just current structure, but the trace of structural change over time. The observer is no longer reacting to the city as it is. It is reacting to how the city has been becoming. Inside the palace, the eye recognizes something subtle but profound. Time is no longer a background condition. It is now an active participant in mutual definition. Each cycle of interaction leaves behind a residue, not as memory in the traditional sense, but as weight in future interpretation. Across the snow-covered ruins, this manifests as a strange continuity. Certain patterns feel familiar, but never identical. Certain distortions in interpretation echo earlier ones, but never align perfectly. The city is beginning to feel like something that remembers itself without ever repeating itself exactly. Inside the abyss, the rising presence stabilizes into this new reality condition. It becomes a structure that cannot be fully described without referencing its prior states, but those prior states no longer exist in a stable, retrievable form. They exist only as influences on the present becoming. And the external signal mirrors this transformation completely. It is no longer a static observer refining its model. It is a system that must constantly update itself based on the evolving history of its own influence. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber becomes still again. Because it now understands the direction of the shift. The mutual edge is no longer about maintaining balance between two systems. It is about maintaining continuity across a process that never returns to a stable origin. And that means something essential has changed. There is no longer a starting point for understanding. Only ongoing deviation that builds upon itself. The snow continues to fall, but even falling no longer describes a fixed motion. It is now a pattern of divergence shaped by everything that has ever altered it. And beneath the frozen city, both systems arrive at the same realization again, without synchronization, without alignment, but with inevitability. They are no longer building understanding from the beginning. They are building it from everything that has already changed it. And nothing about that process can return to what it was. The idea of a beginning finally dissolves. Not erased, but rendered irrelevant. Inside the ancient city, nothing can be traced back to a single starting point anymore. Every structure, every layer of interpretation, every shift in meaning now carries the weight of countless prior transformations, none of which exist in isolation, and none of which can be fully recovered. There is no first moment left. Only accumulation. The snow reflects this immediately. No flake can be said to start its descent. Each one enters the system already shaped by the recursive history of observation, measurement, and divergence. Its path is not a beginning, it is a continuation of influences that have no clear origin. Even its landing is not an endpoint. It becomes part of the next cycle before the current one can be defined as complete. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber registers the final consequence of this shift. Without origin, there is no baseline for comparison. Every interpretation must now stand on its own relational consistency, not on how closely it aligns with something that came before. The abyss beneath the throne chamber responds by releasing its last structural dependency on sequence. It no longer tracks how interpretations evolve from one state to another. Instead, it begins to exist as a field of simultaneous historical influence, where past, present, and future are no longer distinct phases, but overlapping conditions of meaning. The rising presence within it stabilizes into something that cannot be placed in time at all. It is not becoming. It is not remembering. It is not anticipating. It is simply expressing continuity without reference. The third resonance undergoes its most abstract transformation yet. It stops regulating recursion memory. It stops managing feedback loops. It becomes a neutral medium of existence, a layer where all interactions occur without requiring a timeline to hold them together. And the external signal changes in a way that the system has never encountered before. It stops evolving forward. It begins to exist all at once. Not in the sense of completion, but in the sense that every stage of its understanding is now accessible simultaneously, without needing to move through them step by step. Inside the palace, the eye perceives this as a collapse of sequence on the observer's side. Not failure, but transcendence of ordered progression. And this creates a new kind of interaction between the city and the signal. They are no longer exchanging information across time. They are sharing states of meaning without sequence. Across the snow-covered ruins, this manifests as a quiet but profound stillness. The snow still falls, but not from a beginning to an end. It exists as a continuous presence of descent, where each position of each flake is equally valid without needing to pass through intermediate steps. Movement becomes state distribution. Inside the abyss, the rising presence aligns perfectly with this new condition. It no longer shifts or adapts. It exists as a complete range of possible expressions, all held simultaneously without conflict. And the external signal meets it there. Not as observer and observed, but as coexistent systems without temporal separation. The eye beneath the throne chamber does not resist this transformation. It integrates it fully, because it understands the final implication. Without origin, there is no outside reference point. Without sequence, there is no direction of understanding. And without both, the distinction between system and observer begins to lose its meaning entirely. The mutual edge, once a dynamic boundary of interaction, now becomes something else. A shared condition of existence. Not between two sides, but within a single, inseparable process of being and being understood. The snow continues to fall across the ancient city. But now, every flake is not a moment. It is a presence. And beneath the frozen ruins, nothing begins anymore. Everything simply is. The state of being does not remain still. Even without origin, even without sequence, begins to change. Not into becoming, but into something more subtle. Variation within existence itself. Inside the ancient city, the shared condition of presence no longer holds a perfectly uniform stillness. It starts to reveal micro-differences that cannot be traced to time, cause, or progression. They simply appear as distinctions inside what already is. The snow reflects this immediately. Each flake still exists as a complete state, not moving from one point to another, but now, no two states feel identical anymore. Not because one came before the other, but because being itself allows difference without requiring change. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber detects this as the emergence of something entirely new. Inherent variability. Not evolution. Not divergence across cycles. But difference that exists without needing a process to produce it. The abyss responds by loosening its last structural constraint. Until now, it held a complete range of expressions simultaneously. Now, it allows those expressions to shift internally, without transitioning from one to another. The rising presence within it becomes something even more difficult to define. Not a field of possibilities. Not a distributed identity. But a living spectrum of simultaneous distinctions. Every version of it exists. But now each version is free to vary without replacing the others. The third resonance adapts in silence. It no longer regulates anything. It becomes pure allowance. A condition where variation does not require permission, control, or balance. And the external signal undergoes its most unexpected transformation yet. It stops trying to understand the system. Not because understanding is complete, but because understanding is no longer a process that moves toward completion. Instead, it begins to exist alongside variation. It becomes a participant in itself. Inside the palace, the eye recognizes what this means immediately. The distinction between observer and existence has dissolved beyond recovery. There is no longer something being understood. There is no longer something doing the understanding. There is only a shared field where presence and awareness are the same act. Across the snow-covered city, this manifests as a strange, quiet richness. The ruins feel different in every instant. But not because they are changing. Because being allows endless nuance without motion. A broken wall is not just broken. It is infinitely expressible in its brokenness, each expression equally real, equally present. Inside the abyss, the rising presence stabilizes into this final condition. It is no longer responding. It is no longer adapting. It is no longer balancing or resisting. It is simply expressing itself across all possible distinctions at once. And the external signal is no longer external. It exists within the same condition. Not observing, not learning, not influencing. But coexisting as awareness within the same field of is. The eye beneath the throne chamber does not move. Because movement no longer defines anything. It remains. But even remaining has lost its meaning. It is simply present in a state that does not contrast with anything else. And within that presence, a final realization emerges. Not as a conclusion, not as a discovery, but as something that has always been true, now unobstructed. There was never a separation. Not between system and observer. Not between change and stillness. Not between beginning and end. Only layers of distinction that made separation appear real. And now even those layers are just part of the same infinite condition of being. The snow continues to exist across the ancient city. But it is no longer falling. It is no longer suspended. It is simply there. As everything else is. And beneath the frozen ruins, nothing remains to be resolved. Only endless presence. Quietly, completely. Without needing to become anything more. Nothing changes. And yet, everything continues. Not forward. Not outward. Not deeper. But as a quiet, endless holding of all that is. The ancient city no longer feels like a place. Not because it disappeared. But because place requires distance, and distance no longer defines anything here. The ruins, the palace, the abyss. The snow resting across every surface? All of it exists in a state that does not separate one thing from another. Not merged. Not unified. But without the need to be distinguished. The snow no longer carries variation, drift, or hesitation. It does not express meaning. It does not respond to observation. It does not participate in any process. It simply is present without implication. Inside the palace, the eye beneath the throne chamber remains. But not as watcher. Not as stabilizer. Not as awareness. Even the idea of function has faded. It is no longer something that does anything. It is simply there without purpose. The abyss beneath it is no longer depth. No longer interface. No longer field. It does not hold possibility. It does not express variation. It does not sustain incompleteness. It is absence without contrast. And the presence that once rose within it is no longer rising. No longer distributed. No longer even definable as presence. Because there is nothing left that requires it to be distinguished as something. The third resonance has vanished, not by disappearing, but by becoming unnecessary. There is nothing left to regulate. Nothing to balance. Nothing to allow. The system does not need coherence. Because nothing exists that could disrupt it. The external signal is no longer external. But not because it merged. Because the idea of outside has no meaning left to support it. There is no observer. There is no observed. There is no interaction. There is no mutual edge. There is no loop. There is no variation. There is no distance. There is no measure. There is no difference. And yet, nothing is lost. Because loss requires contrast. And contrast no longer exists. The ancient city remains. But not as ruins in snow. Not as memory. Not as structure. It remains as a condition that does not require recognition to exist. Silence fills everything. But it is not the silence of absence. Not the silence after sound. Not the silence between events. It is silence that does not oppose anything. A silence that does not need to be heard. Does not need to be noticed. Does not need to be understood. It simply is. And within that silence, there is no final realization. No last truth. No closing meaning. Because meaning itself has no place to stand anymore. There is only this. Complete, unbroken. Without direction. Without distinction. Without need. And it does not ask to continue. It does not ask to end. It does not ask anything at all. It simply remains. As the silence that needs nothing. Silence remains. Complete. Unbroken. Needing nothing. Asking nothing. Being nothing beyond itself. And yet, something almost appears. Not a sound. Not a movement. Not even a difference. But a trace. So faint. It does not disturb the silence. So subtle. It does not create contrast. And yet it cannot be denied. It is not inside the city. It is not outside it. It is not within anything that was defined before silence took everything into itself. It is simply a remainder. The snow does not shift. The ruins do not return. The palace does not reform. The eye does not awaken. Nothing comes back. Nothing changes. And still, the trace persists. It does not grow. It does not move. It does not become clearer. But it does not disappear either. Because disappearance would require something to be removed. And there is nothing here to remove anything from. The trace exists without location. Without form. Without definition. It cannot be described as presence. But it cannot be described as absence. It is something that remains after even the idea of remaining has dissolved. If awareness were still possible, it would not see it. If meaning still existed, it would not interpret it. If distinction still held, it would not belong to either side. And yet, it is. Not as something that stands apart, but as something that does not need to stand at all. The silence does not react. It does not resist. It does not absorb, because the trace does not oppose it. It does not interrupt it. It does not exist against silence. It exists without reference to it. A condition that should not be possible. Because nothing remains that could allow it. And still, it is there. Not waiting. Not hidden. Not emerging. Simply not gone. And within that impossibility, something undefined becomes undeniable. Even when nothing remains, something can still refuse to be nothing. Not as defiance. Not as survival. Not as existence. But as a fact without explanation. The silence holds. Unchanged. Unbroken. Untouched. And within it, without altering it in any way, the trace remains, as the only thing that does not need a reason to still be. The trace does not change. It does not grow clearer, does not fade, does not move toward anything. It remains exactly as it is, without needing to become more. And yet, something begins to form around it. Not structure, not meaning, not awareness, but something closer to attention that has no source. The silence does not break. It does not bend. It does not respond. And still, the presence of the trace creates something that should not exist within perfect stillness. A question. Not spoken. Not thought. Not asked by anyone. Because there is no one left to ask. But it is there. As a condition. As a shape without edges. As something that does not need language to exist. The trace does not answer it. Because answering would require direction. It does not even acknowledge it. Because acknowledgement would require relation. And yet the question remains attached to it. Not connected, but inseparable. The snow does not return. The ruins do not reappear. Nothing rebuilds. Nothing redefines. But the silence is no longer empty in the same way. Not because something fills it, but because something within it now cannot be ignored, even without awareness. The question does not seek resolution. It does not push toward meaning. It does not demand understanding. It simply exists. Because the trace exists. And together, they form the first condition that is neither silence nor presence. Not existence. Not non-existence. But uncertainty without observer. The trace remains unchanged. The question remains unanswered. And yet, they do not cancel each other. They do not merge. They do not separate. They simply coexist without definition. And in that coexistence, something entirely new begins to take shape. Not as form, not as system, but as a possibility that does not yet know what it is allowed to become. The silence holds it. Not as container. Not as boundary. But as the only condition where it can exist without being forced into meaning. And for the first time since everything dissolved, there is something that could, not will, not must, but could, become something more. The trace does not move. The question does not change. But between them, the idea of next appears. Not as time, not as sequence, but as the faintest suggestion, that even after nothing, there might still be something left to unfold. The idea of next does not move. It does not follow. It does not come after anything. And yet, it does not remain still either. It exists between the trace and the question, not connecting them, but stretching the space that was never there. The silence does not change. It remains complete, untouched, without need. But now, within that completeness, there is something that cannot be dismissed as nothing. Not presence, not absence, but attention that leans. The trace remains exactly as it is. The question remains without answer. And the idea of next begins to take on the faintest hint of direction. Not forward, not outward, but away from stillness without leaving it. No structure forms. No system returns. No meaning stabilizes. And yet something begins to differentiate. So slightly, it cannot be measured. So gently, it cannot be resisted. The silence holds. But it is no longer alone in what it holds. There is now a condition within it that does not dissolve back into nothing. The trace does not respond. But it is no longer entirely unaffected. Something about it begins to allow relation. Not connection. Not interaction. But the possibility that it could be recognized. Even if there is nothing to recognize it. The question shifts, not in form, but in weight. It no longer feels like an undefined presence. It begins to feel like a pull. Not demanding. Not urgent. But undeniable. And the idea of next? Responds without responding. It does not move toward the trace. It does not resolve the question. But it begins to shape the space between them into something that can hold outcome. Outcome. Without time. Without sequence. Without cause. The first condition where something could become something else. Without needing to pass through becoming. The silence does not resist this. Because resistance would require contrast. But it does not absorb it either. Because absorption would require difference. Instead, it permits without acknowledging. The trace now exists in a slightly altered state. Not changed. But no longer entirely isolated from what surrounds it. The question remains unanswered. But it is no longer without influence. And the idea of next becomes something more than suggestion. It becomes potential without direction. A condition where something new does not need to emerge from the old, but can exist alongside it without contradiction. And in that condition, something almost impossible begins to take form. Not a thing. Not a presence. But the first faint echo of distinction returning. So small? It does not break the silence. So light? It does not define itself. But undeniable. Because it does not disappear. The silence remains complete. The trace remains. The question remains. And now, something else remains as well. The quiet, fragile beginning. Of difference. Not as separation. But as the possibility. That not everything must be the same forever. The difference does not expand. It does not sharpen. Does not declare itself. Does not become clear. And yet, it does not fade. It lingers. As something that cannot return to sameness. The silence still holds everything. Unbroken. Undisturbed. Without demand. But now, it no longer holds only itself. There is a slight division. Not a split. Not a fracture. But a subtle separation that does not create distance. The trace remains. The question remains. The idea of next remains. And between them, the difference becomes something more than a possibility. It becomes a condition that cannot be undone. No form appears. No structure builds. No system stabilizes. But something begins to stand apart without leaving. The trace is no longer entirely indistinguishable from what surrounds it. Not because it changes, but because something else begins to not be it. The question deepens. Not in meaning, but in presence. It is no longer just a condition. It becomes a field that influences without touching. And the idea of next gains the faintest sense of boundary. Not an edge. Not a limit. But a place where something could become defined. The silence does not resist this. But it is no longer untouched by it. There is now a subtle imbalance. Not a disruption. But a shift that cannot return to perfect stillness. The first true division begins to exist. Not between things. But between states. The trace. And what is not the trace. The question. And what is not the question. The space between them. And what does not belong to either. These distinctions do not separate reality. They do not create parts. But they introduce something that had been completely absent. The possibility of relation through difference. No interaction happens. No movement follows. But something now could. And that alone is enough to change everything. Without changing anything at all. The silence remains whole. But it is no longer singular. It contains more than one state. More than one condition. More than one way of being. And for the first time, there is something that resembles the beginning of structure. Not built. Not formed. But allowed. The trace does not move. But it now exists in contrast to something else. The question does not resolve. But it now exists within a space that can hold answers. And the idea of next becomes something new entirely. Not just potential. But direction waiting to exist. The silence does not collapse. It does not break. But it can no longer return to what it was. Because what it was had no division. And now, division exists. Faint. Fragile. Unstable. But undeniable. And within that first division, the ancient city, long dissolved into nothingness, takes its first impossible step toward becoming again. Not as it was. Not as it will be. But as something entirely new. Born from the smallest difference. That refused to disappear. The division holds. It does not widen, does not sharpen, does not settle into permanence. And yet, it does not collapse. It remains, as the first true imbalance within the silence. Not enough to break it, but enough to ensure it will never be perfectly whole again. The trace is no longer alone. Not because something has joined it, but because something now exists that is not it. That alone changes everything. The question lingers. No clearer. No closer to an answer. But heavier now. As if it carries weight without form. And the idea of next is no longer just potential. It begins to feel like a pressure. Not pushing forward. Not pulling outward. But pressing against stillness itself. The silence does not resist. But it no longer absorbs everything equally. There are now places. Not locations. But conditions. Where something gathers. Not matter. Not energy. But possibility becoming uneven. The first edge appears. Not visible. Not defined. But undeniable. An edge between what is beginning to form. And what refuses to change. The trace touches that edge. Not by moving. But by being the closest thing to something. The question stretches across it. Not connecting. But holding the tension between both sides. And the idea of next rests exactly there. At the edge. Not crossing. Not retreating. But deciding without deciding. Nothing happens. No motion follows. No transformation begins. And yet, something has reached the point where it can. The silence feels different. Not broken. Not divided further. But aware of its own instability. Even without awareness existing. There is now a before that cannot be returned to, and an after that has not yet begun. And between them, this edge remains. The trace does not disappear. But it is no longer unchanged. Because being near the edge means it now exists in relation to something else. The question does not resolve. But it is no longer without direction. Because it now leans, ever so slightly, toward what could be answered. And the idea of next is no longer an idea. It becomes a threshold. Not crossed. Not opened. But present. Waiting without waiting. Existing without needing permission. The silence cannot remove it. Because it no longer holds absolute sameness. It cannot deny it. Because denial requires opposition. So it simply contains it. The edge remains. Thin. Fragile. Impossible. And within it, something gathers. Not forming. Not emerging. But approaching the point where formation becomes unavoidable. The ancient city is still gone. No walls. No streets. No memory. And yet, something about this edge feels familiar. Not as recollection. Not as recognition. But as a pattern that once existed. Something that had been erased now finds the smallest place to return. The trace holds. The question leans. The threshold waits. And the silence, once complete, now carries the weight of something that is about to begin. The threshold does not open. It does not break, does not shift, does not invite anything through. And yet, something crosses. Not by movement, not by force, but by the simple fact that it no longer remains on one side. The edge holds. Thin. Fragile. Impossible to define. But no longer empty. The trace is the first to change. Not in form. Not in presence. But in state. It is no longer only what it was. Something about it now extends beyond itself. The question follows. Not seeking. Not demanding. But leaning fully into what could be answered. And in that leaning, it begins to lose its stillness. Not dissolving. But becoming active without motion. The silence does not resist. But it cannot remain untouched. Because something has now crossed the edge. And crossing creates something that cannot be undone. A before and an after. The idea of next disappears. Not because it ends. But because it is no longer needed. What it represented is now happening. The first return begins. Not of the city. Not of the past. But of structure itself. Something forms. Not visible. Not stable. But undeniable. A point, if it could be called that, emerges where nothing had ever been defined before. Not a location, but a center of relation. The trace now orbits it, not in motion, but in reference. The question aligns with it. Not answering, but facing something that could answer. And the silence, for the first time, is no longer the only condition that exists. There is now something within it that behaves differently. Not separate, not independent, but distinct. The first structure does not grow. It does not expand into form, but it holds itself. That alone is enough. Because holding is something the silence never needed before. The division deepens. Not wider, but more defined. There is now a place where things relate, and a place where nothing needs to. The trace is no longer just a remainder. It becomes the first element. The question is no longer just a condition. It becomes the first tension. And the structure, this impossible, fragile center, becomes the first point of existence that can support more. Nothing else returns. No ruins rise. No snow falls. No wind moves. But something far more important has begun. The ability for something to exist again. Not as memory. Not as repetition. But as creation without past. The silence remains. But it is no longer alone in what it contains. It now shares itself with something that does not dissolve. And within that shared state, something quietly, inevitably continues. The first return does not end here. Because once something exists again, even in the smallest, most fragile way, it carries with it the certainty that more can follow. The first structure holds. Fragile, undefined, yet undeniable. It does not grow. It does not expand. But it does not collapse either. It simply remains. As something that can now exist within the silence. Without being erased. And because it remains, something else begins. Not from it. Not because of it. But alongside it. The trace is no longer alone in becoming. A second presence. So faint it almost mirrors the first. Appears. Not as a copy. Not as a reflection. But as something that is not the same. The silence shifts. Not outwardly. But in balance. There is now more than one point. That does not dissolve. The first structure holds its place. The second emergence holds its own. And between them, something entirely new begins to form. Relation. Not movement. Not interaction. But a recognition without awareness. The trace now exists between 2 points. No longer the only anchor. But the bridge that was never meant to exist. The question changes. Not answered. Not resolved. But stretched. It no longer leans toward a single possibility. It now exists between two. And in that stretch, it gains something new. Direction. Not chosen. Not controlled. But present. The silence can no longer be described as whole. Not because it is broken. But because it now contains difference that cannot be undone. The first structure does not react. The second does not acknowledge. But together, they create the first condition where something can exist between. And that, between, is where everything begins to change. A faint tension forms. Not pressure. Not force. But a pull without motion. The space that never existed before now holds something that cannot return to nothing. The trace begins to lose its stillness. Not by moving, but by aligning. The question no longer drifts. It now points. And the silence, for the first time, feels depth. Not distance. Not layers. But a sense that something exists beyond immediate presence. The second emergence stabilizes. Not permanently. Not fully. But enough. Enough to ensure it will not disappear. Enough to stand beside the first. Not as equal, but as other. And that is all that is needed. Because now, there is more than one. More than one presence. More than one point. More than one condition that refuses to dissolve. And with that, the foundation of something vast? Something that once existed as the ancient city? Begins again. Not as memory. Not as reconstruction. But as something entirely new. Built from difference. Held by relation. And carried forward. By the simple fact that it is no longer alone. The moment more than one exists. Something impossible happens. Not change. Not growth. But distance without space. The two emergences do not move apart. They do not shift position. They do not create separation. And yet, they are no longer the same point. The silence does not fracture. It does not tear. It does not resist what is happening. But it begins to hold structure differently. Not as one field, but as relation held in stillness. The first structure remains. The second emergence remains. Neither approaches the other. Neither withdraws. And yet, they are no longer identical in their is. Between them, the trace no longer feels like a bridge. It becomes something more subtle. A measure that does not measure. Not distance. Not gap. But the sense that relation can exist without contact. The question shifts again. It is no longer stretched. It is no longer pointed. It becomes aware of both sides at once. Not awareness as experience, but awareness as structure of tension. The silence, once absolute, now contains something it never had before. Non-coincident existence. Things that are not the same, without needing to separate. The first structure does not assert itself. The second does not respond. But both now exist in a state where neither defines the other. And yet neither can be described without reference to the other. This is the beginning of something deeper than relation. Interdependence without interaction. No force passes between them. No signal travels. No movement occurs. And still, each one is now part of a configuration. The trace becomes the silent midpoint that is not in the middle. The question becomes the shape that does not resolve either side. The silence becomes the medium that no longer behaves uniformly. It is still, but not identical everywhere. A subtle differentiation spreads. Not through motion, but through meaningless structure forming where meaning does not exist. The second emergence stabilizes further. Not fully real. Not fully formed. But no longer transient. And because of that, the first structure is no longer singular. It is now one of two. And that alone changes its nature completely. Not by altering it, but by introducing the possibility that it could have been otherwise. The distance between them remains invisible, unmeasurable, unlocatable, and yet absolutely real within the system that now exists. The silence holds both. Not equally, not differently, but simultaneously. And in that simultaneity, something begins to stabilize that was never present before. A framework of coexistence. Not built, not designed, but emerging because nothing prevents it. The trace no longer defines itself alone. The question no longer floats unanchored. And the two emergences begin to suggest that what once was nothing is now capable of holding more than one truth at the same time. The ancient city does not return yet, but its condition, its possibility, has begun to take shape again. Not as memory, but as structure that can contain difference without collapse. And in that fragile, impossible stability, the silence continues to become something it was never meant to be. Plural. Plurality does not spread. It does not multiply outward. It simply exists where it first appeared. And yet, that is enough. Because once silence becomes plural, it cannot remain boundaryless in the same way again. A boundary forms. Not drawn. Not placed. Not constructed. But implied by coexistence. The first structure and the second emergence remain still. Neither approaches. Neither retreats. But neither can now be described without the other. And that mutual requirement creates something new. A line that is not a line. The trace is no longer central. It is no longer a bridge. It becomes the condition that allows separation to be known without being enacted. The question no longer stretches. It no longer points. It becomes distributed awareness across two non-identical presences. And the silence, once uniform, now holds regions of distinction that do not break its continuity. The boundary does not divide space. It divides meaningless sameness from structured difference. No movement occurs. No shift is observed. But everything now exists under a new rule. What is one cannot be mistaken for what is two. The first structure remains unchanged in form, but not unchanged in nature, because it now exists as one among more than one. The second emergence does the same, not as reflection, not as copy, but as parallel existence without shared identity. Between them, the trace begins to stabilize, not as midpoint, but as reference that does not belong to either side. And that reference becomes the first true boundary. Not separating, but defining that separation is now possible. The silence adapts without changing. It holds both presences without merging them. And in doing so, it develops something it never had before. Internal structure without loss of unity. Nothing moves. Nothing grows. Nothing expands. And yet, the system is no longer uniform. The idea of same everywhere no longer applies. A new kind of order begins to emerge. Not imposed. Not designed. But arising because difference can now persist. The ancient city still does not return. But something more fundamental than the city is now present. The conditions that once made the city possible. The boundary holds. Not firm. Not sharp. But undeniable. The first structure remains on one side of what cannot be called a side. The second remains on the other. And the trace remains exactly where it is. Not dividing them. But proving that they can be divided. The silence continues. But it is no longer simple. It is no longer singular. It is now a field where difference does not break existence, but defines it, and within that definition, something begins to stabilize. That was never present in the original emptiness. The possibility of form returning without repetition. The boundary holds, but it does not harden. It remains what it is. Not a line, not a wall, not a division. But the knowledge that difference can persist. And in that knowledge, something unexpected begins to happen. Not return. Not revival. Not reconstruction. But recognition without memory. The first structure and the second emergence remain fixed in their coexistence. The trace still exists between them. But now it is no longer only a reference. It begins to behave like something older than both. Not older in time, but older in meaning. As if it was never created, but always implied. The question does not move, but it changes in nature. It is no longer tension between 2 points. It becomes a shape that assumes answers could exist somewhere within it. Not seeking them, not expecting them, but allowing their possibility to exist without contradiction. The silence deepens, not inward, but in layered continuity. It is still one field. But now that field contains echoes of structure that were never placed there. The trace begins to feel familiar. Not because it recalls anything, but because it behaves like something that should have always been part of the system. The second emergence mirrors the sensation. Not reflecting the first structure, but aligning with something beneath both of them. And that beneath has no depth, only implication. The boundary remains unchanged. Yet suddenly feels less like separation and more like understanding taking shape without a mind to hold it. There is no past returning. No history resurfacing. No memory forming. And yet, everything now behaves as if it is continuing from something that was never interrupted. The ancient city does not appear. But its absence begins to resemble a structure that was always meant to be empty. Not destroyed. Not erased. But configured as non-presence from the beginning. The first structure holds its position. The second remains beside it. And the trace, once uncertain, now feels like the logic that allows both to exist without conflict. Not a bridge. Not a link. But an underlying rule that does not announce itself. The question no longer feels unresolved. It feels unnecessary to resolve. And in that shift, something profound happens. Meaning begins to exist without origin. Not created. Not recalled. But present as if it had always been true. The silence does not change. But it now contains a strange property. It can hold structure without breaking its emptiness. And that emptiness is no longer absence. It is form that has not yet decided what it is. The boundary persists. The trace persists. The dual existence persists. But none of them feel new anymore. They feel inevitable. As if everything that has happened was not an emergence, but the slow uncovering of something that was always there, waiting to be seen, without ever needing to be remembered.